Welcome. Welcome to Economics Matters. I'm Alex Kotlikoff, sidekick of Larry Kotlikoff and co-producer of Economics Matters, the podcast where we look at all things related to economics, including finance, culture, and even journalism. Today we're here with Paul Solman. He's the economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and he's also a good family friend. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Larry here, and he's going to give more of an introduction, and we'll just talk all things Paul.
So Paul's, as Alex said, a close friend and of everybody in the family, but also my co-author of a book that became a New York Times bestseller called "Get What's Yours: The Secrets to Maxing Out Your Social Security." And but his real claim to fame, as Alex indicated, is he's the business economics, an occasional art correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. He's been doing this this is now the 38th year that you've been. I don't know that there's any television journalist who's been working this long. Paul has a retirement plan that's the same as mine, which is retire a year after you die. And that's what we're both going to do.
I think sooner after I die, but after.
Sooner after you die. Okay, that's right. So Paul's got a really kind of interesting history of editing, running smaller newspapers, going to Harvard Business School, being in the Neiman's Fellows Program, working for WGBH, and then I guess that translates into the PBS stint, which goes on for 38 years so far. And he's appearing routinely on the NewsHour, telling us about all facets of the domestic and global economy, personal finance, national finance, economic issues of all kinds. And we're going to talk about those, but I want to give Paul the opportunity to start off by telling us, fill in the details of his career, because we always try and give younger people who are watching this an idea about career paths. So Paul, tell us about your career, and also tell us about this very interesting venture that you're doing on the side, which is the American Exchange Project, which is really a domestic foreign exchange program for high school seniors to spend time in a setting that's different from what they've been growing up in. So red kids go to blue states and blue kids come to red states, and you'll tell us. So take it away.
Okay, great. Well, I think I went to Brandeis University, which is very near where I now live in Newton, Massachusetts. And the thing that I would advise and do advise young people is try out anything while you're in school, because the stakes are low. And I started writing for the Brandeis Weekly paper my freshman year, writing about art. My father's an artist, was an artist. And I worked my way up so that I was the editor of the paper. I took on a co-editor at the time. This is back in the mid-'60s. And so I practiced the career I then actually pursued, and that has gainfully employed me ever since, back when I was in college. So if it's theater arts, it's music, whatever it is, do it as much as you can in college, because you got a free lab in which to do things and get an audience and get feedback. Invaluable. Anyway, I was the editor of the paper. I spent 3 years ducking the draft, the Vietnam War draft, in the late 60s on a fellowship. I then was hired by a previous editor of the Brandeis newspaper to be on one of the weekly alternative weeklies in Boston. They were called Alternative. This is right in smack dab in the middle of the 60s, basically. The 60s run from 65 to 74, let's say. And so this was 1970, and I worked for one or another of those weekly papers. Not so much sex, but drugs, rock and roll. Not drugs that much either, but very left-wing politically. And I was the editor of one of them. Then for a few years, realized I didn't really want to be the boss, went back to writing, got a fellowship at Harvard Journalism Fellowship, Nieman Fellowship, as you mentioned. Spent that at the Harvard Business School for a year, just as a first-year MBA. Friend of mine who was also in the program from Israeli television said, "Why, with stories like this," I'd brought him over to the business school. "I know how to make television. I'd already dabbled in television a little bit. I thought I had more mastery of my self-presentation in television than on print." And like I said, didn't want to be a boss anymore. So I migrated to the local half-hour PBS news show here in Boston, and where I worked on and off for 7 years as just a regular business reporter. There wasn't really such a thing at the time, but at Harvard Business School, I'd learned that you could tell any story basically from a business point of view because they do all case studies, and that's like journalism. And then in 1985, the NewsHour said, "Please do a story for us." At that point, I was teaching at the Harvard Business School for a couple of years, so I did that while starting at the NewsHour. And then after I committed for 2 years to the Harvard Business School, I said no more, and I went to the NewsHour full-time in May of '87. That's been my job ever since. I've taught a bunch, not just at the Harvard Business School, but I taught at Yale for 10 years in a program there called Studies in Grand Strategy. I was a visiting professor at my alma mater at Brandeis, teaching a course there, economic grand strategies, and co-wrote a couple of books, one with you, Larry, which you mentioned, Get What's Yours, and then I was the East Coast editor of Mother Jones magazine in the '70s, and probably can think of other things as well. But it culminates now. I'm the president of the board of this nonprofit, non-political nonprofit called the American Exchange Project, where we do just what you said. We get high school seniors to meet each other online at the end of their senior year, and then after they graduate, kids from Palo Alto go to Jackson, Mississippi, and kids from Gloucester, Massachusetts go to Riggins, Idaho. And we had 100 kids this past summer in 29 communities, and we'll have 300 to 400 kids. I think more than 400, 500 kids already signed up, but there's always some attrition for this coming summer, and we'll be in.
And so the goal of that program is to try and get kids to open and expand their,
Yes. See America, learn how different America is and how different places can be. We're particularly strong in Rocky Mountain states, places where kids don't get out so much. So Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, South Dakota. We're in a number of communities in South Dakota. 30% of our kids had never been on a plane before. And it's expensive because of the airfares. But so it's an effort to heal the wounds of America, or to bridge the great divides: north, south, rural, urban, blue state, red state, high status, low states. So that's a major concern of mine now. So
let me just say, if you go to the American Exchange Project, just Google that; it'll immediately their website will come up. And Paul needs help. Paul needs money. He and his colleagues who are doing this. This is purely, a charitable endeavor, a goodwill endeavor.
It's an expensive endeavor for me.
Yeah. So let's all help Paul by making generous contributions to this. So
that would be great. And your community. We're booked for this coming summer, but we hope to make this something that every American high school senior can do. I mean, that's really our ambition. It's 10 years from now, I don't know. But if we ever get there, but it's scalable. It's scalable.
Scaling, that's great.
Okay, anyway.
I was an exchange student to Germany my junior year. It was like transformation. Right. So I super appreciate what you're doing here. Let's just mention one other thing. Let me say that you've been on the NewsHour so long that you must have thousands of interviews. And if you go to, we think,
I figured I've done between 10 and 15,000 interviews in my life.
Yeah. So the entire economic history of the U.S. from 2009 onward, and maybe before, but from 2009 onward,
Yeah.
coming out of the voice of Paul Solman and the interviews of him. If you put in Google in your search bar or Bing or whatever, Yahoo.com, Paul Solman NewsHour, YouTube, you should come up with his entire opus of work from 2009 onward, and you
I'm
can.
easy to find, that's for sure. You could spend your. I haven't figured out how many. I figure it's more than 1,000 stories, but let's say 1,000 stories, 8 minutes, 8,000 minutes. Somebody can figure out how much of a week. Alex, you can do that
I'll do that.
on a calculator while we're talking. You could do a video festival of my work for sure. I assume you would get tired fairly quickly, but there are a couple of these stories which have 6 million views or 5 million views on YouTube. So some of them have caught the wind, as it were. And,
Yeah. So let me start us off and then Alex will pop in with the first question, which is over this entire expanse of time, 35 years. So we're going back to 1985.
right.
Just from the NewsHour, and then before that, what's kind of a big, or maybe the biggest takeaway about the way the economy operates that was somewhat surprising to you relative to became surprising to you relative to what you had thought going into looking at the economy, interacting with so many people? What's the big takeaway, the biggest takeaway from this entire, experience?
I don't know that there's one, but what comes to mind is when I got serious about understanding business and then economics. I audited goodness knows how many seminars and classes after I got out of the Harvard Business School. So in the late 80s, early 90s for quite a while. So one thing that struck me was the disjunction between the way economists think and how the world actually works. I remember coming back once to WGBH. This was not when I was doing the NewsHour yet. And I had had a discussion with a skeptical Harvard Business School visiting professor, Amitai Etzioni, if you know who that is. And he was saying things, being skeptical of formal economics, and it's sort of precursor of what we now call behavioral economics, right? That is all the things that economics does not take into, that formal economics has not taken into account, or is only now beginning to take into account. So I came back to the group at WGBH. I said, "Oh, listen to this guy, and look, he'd be a great story for our local news." And they all looked at me like, "Well, of course, the world doesn't work the way you say formal economists think the world works." Not that they particularly knew, but when I was telling them about the great insights of Amitai and Leone, they went, "Oh, no kidding. People are biased. People aren't rational. People aren't all trying to maximize." What? So it was drummed home to me early on, this disjunction. And the other, I don't want to call it great insight or anything, but the other kind of emerging aha was that the world is so multifaceted and so unpredictable that the models, and mean no disrespect, Larry, I know you're one of the great practitioners of economic models, but coming up with them and applying them and all the rest, but that the models, by necessity, and I finally understand, I think I understand now why they're as oversimplified as they are. They have to be in order to sort of try to rigorously make sense of certain aspects of the world. So I don't begrudge you trying, but the disjunction, I'll use that word again, between the models and reality is so great that I'm forever struck by, and in fact, you and I have had arguments over aspects of this. I'm forever struck by the not so much the inability of models. I mean, it seems quite obvious if you're trying to simplify something, you certainly run the risk of oversimplifying it, right? And in a world as complex as ours with 8 billion people interacting, of course you're going to oversimplify to come up with some model of human behavior. But that economists don't seem to, or are committed to not recognizing the tremendous shortcomings of their models, or anybody's models for that matter, continues to strike me. I once had a conversation, I remember, with MIT economist who's passed away at a young age, for a relatively young age, Rudiger Dornbush, and I was saying something like this to him, and he said, "Well, yeah, no, but economics explains 70% of human behavior, and that seems to me a lot." I'm totally convinced that economics, as formally thought through and taught, explains about 50% of human behavior.
I used to tell Rudy that. Well, I used to say about Rudy that I wish I was as sure of anything as Rudy was of everything. So he didn't
yes.
pull back.
Well, but
Alex is here. Alex is here to fight back, because he grew up with an economist, and he knows that we're full of truth, and we got it exactly right.
In fact, Alex and I have made fun of you.
Yeah, I don't know who am I fighting back against. Not Paul. I'm not fighting back against Paul here. That's for sure.
No, Alex and I see eye to eye on virtually everything with regard to you. And long have. No, but 70%. Rudy was being pretty generous from his point of view, that economics only explain 70% of human behavior, but I think he was wrong by about half. And it comes out about half. And that's I won't go into this in any great detail, but this was the course I structured when I taught at Brandeis. This is what I was teaching at Yale, trying to teach, which is a worldview of mine, which is that all organic communities, including, most interestingly from our point of view, human beings, is some evolved state of individuals, whether you're bacteria or people, chimps, hamsters, whatever, where you have within you both the drive, the impulse to compete, to predate, to take advantage of, to maximize your own self-interest, and equally the impulse to love, cooperate, take care of one another. You can't really imagine a community evolving that's sustainable if it doesn't have both. So that's my fundamental worldview, and therefore economics, in the sense that it is operating on the premise of rationally maximizing self-interest. It explains half the world, that's all, and only half. But that's not an insubstantial portion. How's that?
Right. I guess part of that is that we're not sure what our self-interest is if we have different personalities in here in our brains.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And we have, and some of us are more rational than others, and and some of us are completely irrational. I mean, and it depends on what area we're talking about as to how irrational or rational we are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, it's clear enough. That struck me the whole time, and when but economists are smart people, very thoughtful people. They know how to think rigorously, is my experience, and so economists have been, and people who are economically savvy have been useful to, interesting to talk with over all these years. I enjoy doing it, and I haven't found the economists I talk to be particularly doctrinaire when it comes to actual issues of the sort that I necessarily cover as a journalist.
Yeah, Alex, do you have anything you want to pop in here?
Well, I'm trying to figure out a question that's not overly philosophical. It's a very interesting discussion we're having, actually. I guess the first thing that comes into my mind is what does economics really explain about, or from your point of view, what have you found the economics to be, a powerful descriptor of?
Okay, it's a good question, and I think I have an answer that satisfies me anyway, which is economics is basically a way of trying to make decisions as well as you can in the long-term interest of the organism. Okay, so it includes psychology, has to include psychology, and therefore behavioral economics has gained the foothold that it has for sort of obvious reasons. It's sort of surprising that it's taken this long, although really the formal turn in economics didn't happen until, I don't know, uh, middle last century, something like that. So it only was about 50 years before behavioral economics started to kick in and say, wait a second, you know, you're oversimplifying to the point that you're missing half the story or something like half the story. But as a way of thinking about how to make decisions, which is basically a process of weighing costs against benefits, then to be able to think about in a serious way what all the current and prospective costs of any decision are, as opposed to the current and prospective benefits of that decision, is a not only is it a useful enterprise, it's something we're doing every minute of the day. And the extent to which we say, wait a second, here's an important decision, I really ought to think about it more carefully than go with my gut, is the extent to which it's a very useful process to engage in. And
Now,
so the extent to which you can, you think about a thing like opportunity cost, one of the basic and I think deepest insights in economics. The opportunity cost is, what's it costing me to do what I'm doing now, given what else I could be doing? Formerly, the next best thing I could be doing. But, and that goes back to Ben Franklin writing about time is money back 1750 or 48 or something like that. That if you're, and I say that, well, I've also taught at community college a little bit for a couple of years. And I would say to the kids, well, what's it costing you to be here? These are kids who, many of them have jobs, not kids necessarily, in fact. And so if they're not at the job, what's a community college is relatively inexpensive, but what's the opportunity cost of being here? What are you giving up? And that's something that most people don't think about. And so that alone is a tremendous contribution, I think, to one's trying to navigate the world.
So we have the question whether people are making rational, here we have this discipline is trying to help people with rational choice. Then there's a question whether people actually are taking the time to make or to even sit down and think about these decisions, or whether they're just too complicated. I mean, our book about Social Security's 13 benefits, but as we're really discussing the 2,728 rules about those 13 benefits, and then the hundreds of thousands of rules about the 2,728 rules.
Right.
Becomes
right. No. Paul Samuelson once said to me, if everybody did this, and I think it was in an interview, he said, look, if everybody is going to scrutinize every decision they make and by carefully weighing all the costs and benefits, never get out of bed, right? It's way too complicated to do a thorough analysis each time you're making a decision. But to get a sense of what are the important costs and what are the important benefits and how much you don't know about the prospective costs and prospective benefits is an extremely useful, I would say, an indispensable skill to have at your disposal. I would go further. I would say that when you're thinking about prospective costs and prospective benefits, there is a rational way to try to estimate what are the odds. Now you're making up the odds. I mean, it's just your sense of what are the odds that everything is going to go belly up on you. I'm going to take this slightly off the personal decision tributary of this conversation. The late economist Marty Weitzman, for years at Harvard, at MIT, and then most of his career then at Harvard. Uh, he was doing very formal mathematical modeling of climate change and what it would mean, and he came upon a set of results from the math that showed how catastrophic for current and future generations it would be if the worst of the climate change scenarios happened. He went looking through the literature and so forth and came up with an estimate of maybe it's 10%. So you got a 90% chance that nothing drastic is going to happen. But the 10% chance is literally a climate or an ecological Armageddon. Right. And so therefore we as a society are obliged, in his analysis, to take mitigating action because it's so bad if the 10% comes through. That's a formal analysis, but it seems to me a profound insight into how we should behave. And so anyway, there you go. So I think that's, in that sense, Alex, the discipline of economics and of thinking rationally about costs and benefits is, like I said before, indispensable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think this, the fact that current generations, even if the average damage from climate change, so that kind of the expected, what would happen on average was zero damage, the risk is a externality, something that we're doing today, leaving our kids and grandkids and other future generations at risk, is itself an externality, which is very subtle and hard to measure, but Marty certainly put his finger on it. But let me take you to if people are people are not acting fully rational because they're not sure who they are or what they really are optimizing. Things are too complicated. Even economists, I've seen this. As you know, Paul, I have this. Alex and I have this software company that helps figure out people's personal finance called Maxify Planner, and I gave the software. I offered to 5,000 economists, sent them basically an email saying, "Look, I'll give you this software for free. You can use it to teach. It does life cycle financial planning. It's exactly what our basic economics courses teach us we need to do. Figure out how much to save and spend, how much life insurance to buy." How many people took up the offer? These are economists from the top 50 departments. The top departments. It was perhaps it was about 1,500, not 5,000. 1,500 people. It's about 10 picked up the offer.
Yeah. So, well, and they're operating on the basis of their opportunity cost, and their, how much is this going to help me versus I'm a very busy guy or woman, I don't know what the value of this is going to be, and therefore, and it's easier to just not do something than to do it, right? I mean, and sure, and that's part of the problem. So from your point of view, it's irrational. From their point of view, they don't know better. Look, for me, I don't need maximize my Social Security or what you're doing, because I guess probably because I started learning economics, in the mid 70s, I started doing a back of the envelope planning of the sort you do. You teach people how much am I going to need to save with some reasonable, not unreasonable rate of return, which I can more or less lock in over some considerable time period. Well, again, making an estimate. Obviously, I don't know. There's no such thing as a totally safe asset, right? But to generate enough income when I need it, so that worst case scenario, living to 110 is what I picked. I won't, to use a phrase you've you've helped teach me, I won't outlive my savings.
Right.
And
So my take
and
would be
I,
a
I
little bit.
monitor that. I don't, look at today's stock prices or anything, but each year I go, okay, are we going to have enough generated to at least have a baseline so that somebody can move in and take care of us here in this very house, my wife and I, or the one who survives, until we're 110. And, and yet the answer is yes. And we won't have to, uh, something you've suggested to people who haven't saved as assiduously as we have, you, Larry, have suggested is, well, okay, you can always downsize and buy a smaller house or get an apartment. And I could, in fact, do that. But we have enough that this house is paid off. And just luckily, because we bought a house when you could afford to buy a house. And we don't have any family money or anything. It's just, Jan worked until.
So I think for you, things are pretty clear. But for lots of people, including most of these economists.
Oh, no. I'm just saying, look, I had the training. I mean,
right.
I had the training of and then I had you. So I was, yes, I've got to be more sophisticated about this than virtually anybody, than your typical journalist, right? I mean,
so let's kind of pivot from behavioral problems of the individual, and I think economics has, my view of behavioral finance is it's kind of mistargeting. In the sense it's kind of studying people's bad behavior as opposed to realizing that economics is so complicated that we should just be telling people what their behavior should be. We should be telling people the basis
for those who don't know Larry as well as his son and I do. Larry is inclined to do this in any case.
That's true.
but I don't disagree. I
don't disagree with that either. Yeah.
When you and I tried to figure out how to do a very rudimentary form of the software you've now got for PBS viewers, well, this was 10, 15 years ago, something like that. Remember, we had the software at that time had these choices, and it was, okay, pick the rate of return you're going to, expect. How long are you going to live? Those were two basic ones. How much are you going to need in the future? Those three, let's say. When you retire, how much will you need? And I tried it out on people at the NewsHour, young people, and they went, "We're not going to touch this." First place, it completely freaked me out. I remember one woman who worked for me saying, "It completely freaked me out to have to ask how long I'm going to live. How would I know? And I don't want to think about it, right? I mean, we're all in denial of death.
It's the maximum age of life, not the expected age.
No, that version was, how long do you think you're going to live? That was you now have modified it. I'm glad to hear. We've talked about it some to something that's more manageable. Or here's what your life expectancy is. Let's do it that way, and add 10 years because you don't want to outlive your savings in case you're an outlier. That I completely agree with. As a useful a way of being useful to people. But I'm just saying, when you have to think about what your rate of return is going to be, people are like, "What? I have no idea what my rate of how much I'm going to need when I retire. A, I don't want to think about it, and B, I haven't a clue." Now, you should have a clue. You should think about it. I have thought about it. I saw how much it cost to keep have somebody living with my father from the time he was 94 until he was 99 and passed away. So I have benchmarks for this, and I've experienced it and all the rest of it. But yes, you do want to help people make these decisions because they are overwhelming.
Right. But then getting people, so we got this kind of, people should do X and they don't do X for many reasons. But then let's talk about the behavior of the economy at large. One of the things you mentioned to me before we, today, earlier on, before we started, was that developing this sense that of unpredictability about the economy. That over the years, this is one of the big insights about the economy, its unpredictability, and the fact that the experts are so often wrong. Do you want to expand on that and kind of talk
Well,
through this?
I said to you that I began. It was really at the very beginning of my career. There was the oil crisis. This is when I was in Harvard Business School, actually. I mean, when I was in the first year of the MBA program, and I was struck by the fact that while I was kind of overwhelmed by gas going from 29 cents a gallon to 73 cents a gallon overnight, basically in 1973, so that I'd have to wait in long gas lines to get gas and find a place that had gas. So I, as a human, just as a normal citizen, I was kind of shocked by it. I didn't realize until I started studying this stuff how no economist had predicted that this would happen, although it was a fairly simple matter of the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, turning off the tap, right? And then understanding, as I studied economics, what elasticity is, that is responsiveness or lack of responsiveness to price changes. But so economics has a way of thinking about this, and it's a very useful way of thinking about it. If people can't stop using something, they can't be very responsive to price, and therefore the price will go up, right? And people will continue to pay the price. That's the moral of that story, but from an economics point of view. But the fact that nobody that economists, what you called experts, so-called experts, the people on whom one relies for forecasts, didn't ever tell you that was going to happen. That markets, even all the people betting on what's going to happen in the future, didn't get it right. Certainly was the beginning of my understanding that forecasting is a mug's game, and then it was reinforced when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was what? Nobody said the Soviet Union was going to collapse. I mean, there's some people out there, but and then the crash of '08. Yes, Bob Schiller said that the housing situation was unsustainable. And I actually quoted him and Nouriel Roubini.
Yeah.
And I did a story with him in November of 2006. I was pretty convinced, but I had to, because it's an even-handed show, the NewsHour. I had an economist named Ed Yardeni, and I took Nouriel and Ed around New York and to Hoboken, and to play out the argument. So they had the argument in various telegenic places where housing was being built, and Ed Yardeni said, "Don't be ridiculous. This is not. Look at what's being built. It'll all be fine."
I think Yardeni was right. I think.
Well,
let me just give you a little factoid here, because I read this book, Jimmy Stewart is Dead, which we'll add commercial ad here for that book, because I talked about Anthony Mozilla, who was running Countrywide Financial. So a year and a half before housing prices actually started to fall, according to the same Shiller's index of housing prices, he comes out and publicly says housing prices are like in the worst collapse ever. This is a year and a half before the Great Recession hits. And why he said this, he had no factual basis. Maybe it was just the homes that he was mortgaging. But one of the things I wanted to get at here is the ability of people to hop onto misinformation, and for everybody to become, collectively pessimistic, and then recessions become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you go back 6-9 months, you have former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, even 3 months, claiming we're going to have a recession this spring and this winter. we had Goldman Sachs had, you had the head of JP Morgan. These are the top, forecasters, everybody, the front page of CNN, Bloomberg. Now, none of them is saying today we had it wrong. They may still be right. There may still be a recession coming, but now Goldman Sachs is predicting a 1% growth for the year. I think people like to say the opposite of what's happening to get headlines and to get, views and attention. And that's for the press and the politicians. And that this has the, people listen too carefully to these people and then they act on it. Alex, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm curious what Paul thinks about that. I think the question here is economics a sort of a prescriptive analysis of the world? Can it actually change the world in ways that economists or experts want to see the world change in, or is it just purely descriptive?
Or make believe? It makes, could also be that economists are making up stuff. Larry Summers is an economist, right? Diamond, the guy ahead of Solman, of Goldman, they're both economists. They're all economists in some sense. But what they're saying is kind of based on, Jamie Dimon said back in June that a hurricane was coming to the U.S. economy. He said it could be Hurricane Sandy, but he couldn't say for sure. Are these comments, Paul, useful? Are we just flipping the economy?
Not useful to me. I mean, it's useful to know what people are saying, and I don't begrudge Jamie Dimon coming up with his own, I assume, best guess as to what's happening. Just don't think the world is predictable that way. I think that's my point about 8 billion people interacting with each other. All right, a lot of them don't interact with each other, but even a couple of hundred people interacting with each other, and you're going to have a hell of a hard time, because some people are going to think, well, what's he going to do? And if she does that, then will he do that? I mean, and then it becomes recursive, is a term that I think George Soros has used about markets. And John Maynard Keynes pointed this out 100 years ago, or close to 100 years ago, with the stock market, and it being a game in which you're trying to figure out what the other guy is trying to figure out, the other person is going to try to figure out, right? And that's true of all decision making perspective. That's why it's so difficult to do. But to be forecasting is, you take your best guess. We're all forecasting all the time. That's what I was saying earlier about, you're making a guess as to what's going to happen based on the decision you're about to make, right? So we're all forecasting, and we're naturally, I mean, it cannot be that we don't have, as human beings, don't have algorithms for forecasting, like animals.
Right? I mean, Jamie can forecast all he wants in his, in his bedroom, but or his study. But to go on national,
people ask him. He's the head of whatever the hell he's the head of.
They asked him whether he had a short position on the stock market when he made the statement.
Well, they should have asked him that. They should have asked him that too.
That's what I wondered.
Yeah, no, they should ask him that. But people, it's not that. It's a perfectly natural thing. People ask me, for Christ's sake, and then I tell them what I'm telling you. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'll hedge exposure that I have. I mean, buy S&P puts, for example, because there's enough of my future wealth in the stock market, although less than a lot of people I know, that in order to make sure that I don't outlive my savings, I will hedge against I don't. It's not because I think the stock market's going to go down. It's because I've got enough risk in the stock market that I want to have insurance against the terrible thing happening that could happen. That's all.
Well, I would just say that I think it's highly irresponsible for somebody in that position to make that kind of a statement without.
I'm not making any judgments
of
that sort. I just don't. Yeah, you can judge anybody you want. You have models that make predictions. You have models that they completely convince you. I mean, and that I don't buy at all. So, I mean, so it's not you're doing. I mean, you're not getting quite as much press as Jamie Dimon, maybe. But when when you talk about Social Security being bankrupt, and for those who are interested in our argument about this, we in chapter 17 of What's Yours, only get the revised edition, by the way. The first edition is out of date and misleading. But in that chapter, you talk about Social Security being bankrupt and it's hell to pay, and I go, no, we'll muddle through. And I think your forecast as to the future of the unfunded liabilities of Social Security is wrong. But I don't begrudge you making the forecast. Anywhere that I begrudge you having written a book called The Coming Generational Store, which may, okay, boomer suggests that there was some merit to your argument, but not, I don't think, in exactly the way you thought. Although certainly some merit to it.
I think economists have a responsibility to be conservative and be look at, go back to Marty's.
You yourself are not humble with respect to your forecast. So I don't see how you could be knocking Jamie Dimon.
No, but it's the nature of the forecast. If you look at the downside risk, that's what and one of the downside risks is saying things that would put the economy into recession. That to me, we want to be doing things that are actually securing the future, even if we're being overly protective.
Maybe, but
okay,
yeah, maybe, but I'm not. The basic insight here, which is that prophecies can be self-fulfilling, hence the cliche, a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't doubt that for a second, but the idea that and I don't doubt the notion that prophets, prophets, should be humble with respect to their prophecies. I don't contest that either. But they aren't called prophets for nothing. And they aren't asked their opinion for nothing. And it goes back to as far as, it's the Oracle at Delphi. I mean, there are people traipsing to the Oracle at Delphi, 2,500 years, 20, whatever it is. Yeah, 2,500 years ago, more, further back. The I Ching, for Christ's sake. Where people are it's just a natural human thing. You want to blame the guy who wrote the I Ching? I mean, it's people are trying to anticipate the future. We started
this whole about one event that you told me about, or that you had some views about, which is Volcker's so-called presumed increase in interest rates back in, I guess, 79 to try and stop inflation. We're in a very similar situation now. Jerome Powell raising interest rates through the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
And
yes, and Volcker and the Volcker shock, so-called Volcker shock, is his model for what he's doing. Right.
Right. So tell us, everybody, about your take on that episode. What really happened?
All right. Well, I as I said to you, my take is really is out on the tail of the distribution. I can't even get people whom I respect and ask about this to agree with me. So I could be completely wrong. And I
agree with you, by the way.
I am profoundly humble with respect to my ability to prophesy. That said, I've never bought the argument that Paul Volcker, by doing what he did, brought down inflation. I thought at the time, and have never really had any reason to rethink the idea that this was, as I said early on here, a function of the so-called Arab oil embargo, the OPEC oil embargo, let's call it, that drove up prices for absolutely standard and understandable reasons, that then started a cycle of, wait a second, if gas costs this much and energy is a component of almost everything we use, then I'd better get a raise, and therefore the company has to give me a raise, which means the company has to raise its prices, and this is the famous wage price spiral, or as a producer of mine once said to me, why don't they call it the price wage spiral? I said, I don't know, because actually I think that's what it is. It is the price-wage spiral. And that's expectations. That's, I'm sure it's fueled by, if you'll pardon that verb, it's fueled by headlines and, Cassandras and, Chicken Little, sky is falling people. But you can quite easily explain it without regard to the media.
So the price. So Volcker doesn't cause the prices to go up. I agree with you how they went up, and what kept them going up. But he does announce a change in monetary behavior on this one day in 1979, and then fill us in on what happens.
Well, I mean, the standard story, which I think most people, certainly anybody listening to this, would know, is that he does what the Federal Reserve in recent decades, not originally, but is supposed to do, which is to, in the words of Eisenhower's, I think, head of the Fed, take away the punch bowl once the party threatens to get out of hand. I don't know the exact quote, but it's the punch bowl for sure. That is, the economy is becoming intoxicated, it's shrinking too much. You want to take away the punch bowl, slow things down, put on the brakes. That's back in the 50s, President Eisenhower. So now Volcker does that in the 80s and late 70s. He takes over and then starts slamming on the brakes by raising interest rates, therefore making it more expensive for people to buy things, for companies to invest in things, and certainly for people to borrow to do either of those things. And then it slows the economy way down. You have unemployment, you have a recession, and lo and behold, inflation goes away. Volcker succeeded. That's the story. And I say,
McChesney Martin was the
William McChesney
under Eisenhower.
Yeah,
so you got Eisenhower.
William McChesney Martin was the punch bowl guy. I didn't think I would drop that name. That's all. But when I look at it, I say, okay, wait a second. Nobody denied that the inflation started. Well, that's not fair. Nobody denied that a major factor in triggering the inflation was the rise in oil prices. There is an alternative story, which sure there's some merit to, which is we were doing deficit spending, that we weren't paying for the wars on poverty and Vietnam. That's another part of the story. Although when you look at debt as a percentage of GDP, I don't think that story holds up tremendously well either. But if we all agree, or everybody did agree, by and large, everybody, that oil was a huge factor, the price of oil was a huge factor in driving inflation, and then look at what happened to the price of oil, which has virtually nothing to do with what Paul Volcker did, right? The price of oil goes from $30 a barrel, if I'm remembering correctly, I haven't looked it up recently, but I think it was about $30 a barrel in 1979. And by the mid-'80s, I'd have to look, but it's down to $10 a barrel. I remember doing a story with T. Boone Pickens. I think it was late 87, and oil was down to 10 something a barrel. That wasn't because of Paul Volcker. And so to your story, Larry, which is expectations have a huge amount to do with this, collective mentality. Hey, we got to get a raise now because, prices are going to continue to go up. Toilet paper is off the shelves. There's no more toilet paper. Why? Because people said there was going to be no more toilet paper. What? And yet the shelves were bare, right?
So that's a
couple of years ago, even because at the beginning of the pandemic, there's going to be no more toilet paper. Right. So of course, expectations have a huge amount to do with all of these larger movements in the world. And so I think what happened with inflation, again, I'm a complete outlier on this, but within anybody who's conversant with the economics community. But I think Volcker had precious little to do with it. I don't even know that he had nothing. His raising interest rates had nothing to do with it. Maybe they had a big impact on people's expectations. And maybe that's what was useful about what Volcker did. But just looking at the price of oil, suggests to me that it was other things going on. And when later Fed chairman Greenspan and then Ben Bernanke both said about the crash of '08 that they weren't responsible for not having raised interest rates, that they weren't responsible because they had kept interest rates so low, both of them said, no, the world was such that there was a glut of savings and there weren't as many investment opportunities. And that's why interest rates were low. We were essentially following the world, not leading it. And I believe them.
Yeah, well, on that score, just to say, factually, what happened when Volcker announced that he was going to target money supplies for the next 3 years, based on kind of Milton Friedman's view of how money connects to price to inflation. So we had this high inflation. He says, "Okay, I'm going to do what Friedman says to do." If you look at historically, what he did was he missed all these targets. Basically, there's no change in actual money supply behavior. But the minute he makes this statement, interest rates in the marketplace jump up dramatically because traders act on what they believe other traders are doing. So the Fed didn't actually set a higher interest rate, and the interest rates went up on their own. It didn't have to do anything in terms of buying and selling securities to have those interest rates go up. It didn't keep them from going up, but they did go up on their own. So there's an example of, where somebody's sentences, a one sentence statement, can change behavior, expectations and beliefs about the economy so dramatically that we had 20% short-term interest rates, and now we have people saying, should I really borrow to buy shirts to sell at Christmas time at that interest rate? Forget about it. I'll rather lay off my workers.
Yeah.
And that led to a recession. So,
look, yeah. I interviewed Volcker. I interviewed Volcker in the early, I think it was 1983. And he said to me off camera, he said, Jesus, he was a very plain spoken guy. He said, last night, he said, I gave a speech. I think it was last night. It might have been a week before or something. So I gave a speech. I mentioned something about interest rates. The next day, the interest rates I can't say a damn thing about interest rates. I just got to, he himself was saying he was kind of amazed by it. So that doesn't go very well with the story that all along he'd planned, to do this. But yeah, I mean,
it's kind of like
he was really aware of the impact he had, and that's why Fed chairs always are, they're always double talking their way because they're afraid of doing something that will have, unintended consequences, deleterious unintended consequences. I remember I was once at a conference, a speech that Greenspan gave, and then I was moderating a panel afterwards, and Greenspan, he was starting the speech. He said, well, I'm not going to give this speech. And then Paul Solman afterwards are going to tell you what it means. It was like, it was my great moment in the sun. I was like, my God, Alan Greenspan. But what he meant was, I'm not going to tell you anything that's going to be revealing. That's all.
Yeah. So you've interacted with lots of, Greenspan and Volcker and, Treasury secretaries over the years. Who did you find kind of the most interesting, most fun of these
No, I only remember when you ask a question like that, I have a perverse response, which is I remember what an incredible gentleman Dominique Strauss-Kahn was, taking me by the arm, leading me around. He was the essence of French civilization. And, I think that was when he was running World Bank, I guess. Or IMF, I don't remember. And I thought, what a great guy. You can't.
You need to explain now to the listeners and viewers what happened with him.
You tell him what happened to him. I'm embarrassed that I was taken with him.
Alex, you remember?
Yes, I remember. Of course I remember. Oh, Alex, do you remember?
I don't remember the specifics. Right, he was harassing a maid in his
No,
hotel.
oh my God, that was no. He was part of a sex trafficking
Oh,
old
it
guy.
was much deeper than that. Oh, I didn't
Well, we
Oh
realize.
don't
my
know whether he
God,
was
yes.
convicted. Paul, we don't know if he was
Oh my.
convicted. We don't, do we?
Or he was allegedly.
Allegedly,
Allegedly.
He was
It's allegedly.
allegedly a really, really sleazy guy.
yeah.
Uh, uh, anyway,
But to
but
Paul's
no,
point,
I
you
mean,
don't really know a person through most interactions actually that
no,
you
you just, I mean, and you're,
right.
you're the reporter. They have their must air points. The things that they have to get across. I mean, look, I, I love Lula. I thought I mean, he maybe as great a guy as I thought he was. Of course, he wound up going to jail. Also, that may be a put up job in Brazil. Who the hell knows?
This is the current new president
Our
elect.
Yeah,
current
yeah. I thought he
president.
was. I interviewed him in the '90s when he was president. He was a fantastic guy. I just loved the guy. I mean, I think we hugged goodbye. Even I thought
Listen,
Christine Lagarde was fabulous. I mean, and I'm not saying she isn't. I understand. Robert Rubin, I really liked him. But they're that's how they got to be
Lagarde,
who
by
they
the way, is
are, is by being, you know, political and appealing and charming with people who are going to either make them look good or not. So I'm under no illusions about my relationship to any of these people.
yeah,
I
Lagarde,
just
by the way, is the head of the European Central Bank, and
and she
Rubin
was the
was
head of the
the
IMF when I
former,
interviewed her.
former Treasury Secretary under Clinton. So
No, 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 no. She was who? Christine
no,
Lagarde.
no, Robert Rubin,
Oh, Robert Rubin.
Or
Yes, yes.
Ruben,
That
yeah.
was when he was the sec. Yeah, and
Treasury Secretary.
he had he had dollar bills. He had them in little envelopes, a little circle under them. He'd give you a dollar bill that he had signed. I mean, not signed. It was a Robert Rubin signed dollar bill. I mean, uh, so no, but I like everybody. So I'm, I'm not a good person to ask who I
I see.
liked best.
Got it. Okay. So, Alex, any final thoughts? We're ready to wrap this up, I think, time
Yeah, well, I
wise.
guess the my last question to Paul would be, what's your maybe not your single forecast, but your overall sort of assessment of where we're going in
I
terms of
have
the economy and politically too. I'd like to get
yeah.
your thoughts on that as
Well,
well.
I have a very grim analysis of where we're headed um, as a civilization. I have to confess uh, the and that's why we're doing. That's why I'm so committed to the American Exchange Project. I do think it's an obligation more than that it behooves us, but that we all have an obligation. We who are as fortunate as the three of us are, say, with regard to where we stand in the world economy and in terms of our education and our material wealth and the rest, our health, um, to to do something to make sure that the bad things that I'm afraid will happen don't happen. And so the American Exchange Project is some attempt to do that domestically in a way that I think I can be of some service. Having people making friends across the divides, because I do profoundly believe that we human beings, no matter where we are, have far more in common than divides us. And I think politics is to not talk to people because of their political beliefs. We have somebody at the American Exchange Project, one of our key people. We have a small staff, and he's a Trump supporter. I like the guy enormously, and yet to me, Trump is anathema. Okay, so but that doesn't prevent us from being friends and working together and the rest. And we both believe in the idea of people getting along and getting. Oh wow, I don't know who those people are. That was while I'm talking to you. I just got a message that a couple, whom, as you just heard, inadvertently I don't know, gave the American Exchange Project $250,000. So
Hey,
So it's like we could do this as a
Yeah.
telethon. Okay, and
We're
see
not
if
even
any
live. So.
sure, why not?
Alex, can you match?
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to go in at this late stage in this discussion to go into why I have such a grim view. It has to do with how much destructive power there is in the world and how accessible it is to people, how unhappy people are with the great divide in status and wealth in the world, the extent to which people, when they feel dissed, um, as so many people do in the world, as they see people who are so much wealthier or better off than they are, people like us, resented and then act on their resentment. The declining role of men in the world and how, therefore, resentful men will be when they are becoming, as they become less and less useful to people. My old joke used to be when I'd help a woman with her luggage in an airplane, I would say, thank you. No, it's okay. Men are only good for two things: diversifying the gene pool and taking luggage out of overhead compartments. It turns out that nowadays you don't need men for either of those things. So even the old joke doesn't work, and so forth. And so that there are this confluence of forces, and the technologically savvy among us versus the technologically unsavvy. Just look at, I don't know if anybody out there, I'm sure many people who listen to this have played with Chat GPT, and you can see how many jobs and how much skill that simply replaces off. Just don't need all kinds of jobs that even people like us used to at least have people doing. Um, so I have all those factors, I think, make for a real witch's brew. And I'm even talking about climate change here. Um, a real witch's brew with regard to the future. And so all I can say is either you can throw up your hands or you can say, let's try to do something. You can give us money at the American Exchange Project to start your own project. A lot of different things going on, but we ought to be paying attention to them
And
and
there's a
trying to.
global, just to add to the morose conclusion here, there is a global witch's brew as well. We've got the Ukraine,
Oh
Putin's,
yeah, no,
and we've
I'm
got
looking at I'm
China.
looking at things that I think are longer term trends than specifically COVID or Ukraine or things that when people talk about what's I've seen it referred to as the poly crisis, and I think Muriel Rubini has another phrase for it which escapes me at the moment, but they're talking about what you're talking about: COVID, Ukraine, proximate things. I grant you, those are all hugely problematic. But the larger trends that I'm talking about would include destructive power, for example, in the hands of more, tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Well, on that happy note, Alex, you want to wrap things up here?
Yeah, well, I think I think I kind of agree with Paul there, and I think that as much as there's so much we don't know with respect to the economy and forces outside of our control, stock market, finance, flows of money, transfers of value. There's a lot we do know, and people are really unhappy, and that single indicator alone
Yes.
shows a kind of a grim future. So I'll end with my own morose note right there.
I
Right.
talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, right?
No, I hope everybody has a good day after all this. Paul, thanks. Listen, thanks so much.
Oh,
We'll have you
sure.
back on, and you've only been at it for 38 years, so let's start
Well,
working.
it's 38 years at the NewsHour. As a business correspondent, that's 1977. And of course, I've been a journalist since 1970. So, and then if you count Brandeis, I've been a journalist for 60,
Yeah.
60
Well,
years. Yeah.
from your tennis game, you're just a kid, from what I can tell. So,
Yes, I am young at heart, or devoutly immature, as I sometimes explain.
yeah. Okay. Thanks anyway,
Hey,
and
guys.
we'll see you soon. Bye bye.